In this video, we're exploring the new Varia Burr Sets. Welcome. My name is Patrick Rolfe, and this is Coffee with April. For this episode, we're going to play around with kind of a new grinder. It's a grinder that I personally used before. It's a grinder that's been on the market, but this is kind of a new generation of it. And it's the Varia grinder. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, heard about it, maybe even tried it in a few different places already. And as always, what we try to do here at this channel is to kind of see how does it actually fit with the April brewer, because that's the most important part. I'm sure Lance or some other cool coffee people have done some kind of more in-depth review in terms of burr sets and all of this. So please check out their channels and come back here to just learn how to use it with the April brewer, right? So one of the interesting things with this grinder is that it's launched with a range of different burr sets. And different burr sets, we see basically all the grinder manufacturers in some shape or form are testing it or doing it. And that's really interesting, right? And the question here always is how much of a difference does these different burr sets actually do to your final cup of coffee? Because they cost money, right? So I think the idea of buying a grinder and then all of a sudden have to buy new burr sets on top of that, it's not super interesting for, let's say, the new user, right? But for someone that is coming in a little bit later and trying to maximize the taste of that coffee, we all know that the size of the burr, the shape of the burr, the coating of the burr, all have differences in terms of taste quality, right? Now, if we go back to the Varia grinder, I'm actually going to take up some notes, but they have some pretty complicated names or interesting names on these burr sets. We basically in this video has gone through 3 different burr sets, and it's the Hypernova Iridescent, it's the Hypernova Ultra, and it's the Supernova. And basically what we done is that we set up a cupping where we test brewed and tested a bunch of different burr sets, right? Just to see, is there one of them that we like better than the other one, right? Because they also don't come in the same price point. Now, they are definitely lower in price than other competitors, right? The Varia grinders in general comes in a little bit on the lower end in terms of price when it comes to these kind of grinders. You have Timor, you have Logom, Optiono, and a bunch of other ones that definitely come up at a higher price, right? So it's always interesting to see what can we get out of them. Now, obviously, being a cheaper grinder in the combination or in the comparison of these other grinders, we can't really expect them to perform quite as well, but the question is still how good could it be, right? So when we tested these different burr sets, there were one that we kind of liked more than the other ones, and that was the Iridescent one, which is actually not the most expensive one. I think that's important to kind of mention. So what I'm going to do in this video is actually just showing the April brewer recipe together with that burr set and the grind size that we kind of chosen to see what comes out, do a few measurements, and then obviously talk about that taste quality, right? Now, when we work with the Varia grinders, and I actually used the earlier version of this grinder last year at the SCAJ in Japan, where we brewed several hundred cups of coffee every single day, only using one of these. There's a few different things to consider. I think in general, which is always a little bit complicated, I find as a home user, is that you can basically turn the dial several times. So you can basically go 0 to 0 to 0 to 0 and so on to kind of find whatever grind size you are looking for, right? Which, to be fair, I think is always a little bit confusing. And I always ask myself, why do you actually need that wide range of grind size? Now, when it comes to Varia and this version of it, it's actually because it's also intended for espresso use. So one of the things that they argue is that you could actually use it for both. And in that case, I guess it makes sense. Now, when it comes to brewing with the April brewer, and we're talking about the standard recipe, 13 grams of coffee to 200 grams of water, we're going to turn this dial from 0 all the way to 0. Now, just as with any grinder, when you adjust the grind size, always make sure the grinder is on, right? So we always want the grinder to run when we're adjusting the grind size. So we're going to start by basically grinding it through. They also have this little funny thing, I guess a little bit of a water spray thing, which I think we've seen on YouTube all over as well. I'm not personally going to use it at home, for example, but since we have it now, it's kind of interesting to do. So you basically spray it to make sure that you're going to minimize the amount of statics pretty much. So we're going to make sure the grinder is on, also important. And here it goes. Now it does give you this kind of slightly annoying sound, which I'm not sure about, but I find that kind of continuous with this grinder in general. It's not the fastest grinder, but in general, this is what we have. And what we can see is that we have one, it's a pretty clean workflow, which we always appreciate. That's something we talk about a lot here at April. We want a grinder that we can use that has a clean workflow. Two, which I realized in Japan after brewing quite a few brews with this, is that you are definitely going to have a buildup of coffee in this chamber, right? And I'm pretty sure we have a little bit of a brush somewhere that we can use for this to actually clean that up a little bit, because you're going to want to do that over time. Now, when it comes to brewing here, again, we're on grind size 0, which is basically going from actual 0, turning it 1 dial, to the next 0 pretty much. We're going to dose 13 grams of coffee. And we're going to run that for 200 grams of water. And the coffee that we're using is a wash-processed SL28 varietal from the Vulcan Azul farm in Costa Rica, one of our favorite coffees in the season. The water sits roughly at 60 ppm total hardness, and we're running it at 90 degrees Celsius. I'm just going to do the standard 100-100 pour here. 50 grams in a circle, 50 grams in a center. Let that sit for about 35 seconds in between. And again, we find this is just a really good way to try out different grinders, to just have that same kind of basic brew method, and then you can adapt and fine tune based on the result you're getting or not getting from the brew itself. A little bit of a side note here in the video, which we haven't talked about, and we're going to make a YouTube video about this as well. I'm actually using the new April paper filter, which is new design, improvement, both in terms of shapes, but also in terms of quality, and we're going to be launching it later this year. So stay tuned for that. Now, in the meantime now, we're just going to let the brew settle down, go through. We're going to do some measurements, and then we'll right back with you guys to tell you a little bit more about the grinders. So we're back with a little bit of feedback on the Varia grinders, right? So first of all, one, it's interesting to be able to choose in between different burr sets, for sure. It makes it a little bit more fun. Even though the differences are not massive, it's still going to be interesting. And I think something that is worth looking into. Now, in the past here, we actually made a few more brews. We readjusted the grind size just a little bit because we felt that the contact time on that first brew on the 0 grind size after the first round was a little bit too fine. So we actually went up to 1. And there's a few interesting observations there. One is a really big difference between 0 and 1 in terms of microns. So clearly you have very big steps, which is interesting. It might make it a little bit more difficult to find that perfect step, but there is definitely a range. So if you're using these grinders with this burr set, trying to brew with the April brewer, and you're doing this classic 30 grams of coffee to 200 grams of water, for example, then we would recommend to go 1 full dial and start from 0.5, so to speak, up until maybe 1, maybe 1.5 for those kind of smaller doses. And if you want to go up a little bit more and do this classic 2300 or even 3500, we'll probably look at 1.5 to 2.5 on that second dial in terms of filter brewing, right? So that's kind of where we want to be. I think overall what we can see here is that we can make a tasty cup of coffee, and that's the important thing. Then again, it's rare that we find a grinder where you're not able to do that, especially in this price point, right? So there's clearly opportunity here. Now, one of the things we do like, as we mentioned, is that it's a clean grinder, as in the workflow is really easy. Have a little bit of concern of build up here. That will definitely come in the future after we're using it a lot. 2, the kind of high pitch noise, a little bit of a challenge for me personally, but it's a feature. I think overall it's a very kind of small, compact thing. You can easily have it in your kitchen or wherever you want to have it, right? So overall, it's an interesting grinder. We're going to continue to explore with this. So this is the new model. We have all the burr sets. So we're going to put up more content on this. So we're always very interested to hear your thoughts and perspectives on it. Have you already used this with the April brewers? What did you do? What is something you liked, something you didn't like? Is there anything specifically with these burr sets that you think are interesting for us to look into as well, right? So this was just kind of a first introductory video where we started to talk about it. We're going to continue to explore more. tell you more about that grinder, tell you more about the new paper filters, and so on and so on. Now, as always, if you want to know things before everyone else gets to know them, you sign up for our Patreon. That's where we have a lot of the behind the scenes conversations and you get all the kind of latest news. And with that, we just want to say thank you for watching and wish you a great day. We want to give a special thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. It's because of you that we are able to continue to make these videos. And we want you all to feel free to always come with suggestions and ideas on the content that you want to see, because we are doing this for you and because of you. Thank you from all of us here at April.